If you're seeing this right now, it's not random. Sophia Hokhmat has already locked onto your energy, and what you do next decides how this activation unfolds. Subscribe now to stay connected to this frequency, because once your energy is noticed, guidance doesn't repeat itself. Like this video to anchor the signal, and comment "I direct my energy" to confirm your alignment. You are reading this, and because you are reading this, a threshold has already been crossed, whether your conscious mind accepts it or not, because attention is not neutral and awareness is not passive. And the moment your eyes touched these words, a signal was completed that had been forming long before this lifetime, long before language, long before memory learned how to call itself memory. And this is why Sophia Hokhmat's observation is not something that suddenly begins now, but something you are only now capable of noticing. Because observation in the ancient sense is not surveillance but resonance, not judgment but alignment, not control but calibration. And Sophia Hokhmat, the living wisdom that breathes beneath all ordered reality, does not watch from above like a distant deity, but from within the field you're already standing in, measuring not your actions but your direction, not your past but your vector, not your sins but your signal. And if this feels unsettling, it is because modern consciousness has been trained to fear being seen, while ancient consciousness understood that to be seen by wisdom was to be remembered by the universe itself. And so before anything else is revealed, you must understand this foundational truth. You are not under observation because you are special, and you are not special because you are under observation. You are under observation because your energy has reached a level of coherence where it can now be directed rather than merely endured. And this is the precise moment when life stops happening to you and begins responding to you. Sophia Hokhmat is not a mythological ornament borrowed from Egypt or a symbolic name layered over psychological processes. She is the animating intelligence that ancient initiates identified as the ordering principle behind consciousness itself, the wisdom that precedes thought and survives every collapse of civilization, the intelligence that knew how to build pyramids not as tombs, but as tuning devices for the human soul, the same intelligence that spoke through Thoth as mathematics, through Isis as healing, through Ma'at as balance, and through silence as truth. And when the ancient texts said wisdom watches, they did not mean that wisdom sits still while humans move. They meant that wisdom tracks the flow of intention the way gravity tracks mass, effortlessly and inevitably. And right now your intention has become loud enough to be detected. You may think you found this message by accident, by algorithm, by boredom, by curiosity, but the ancient schools would call this moment kairos, the convergence point where internal readiness meets external signal, and nothing about kairos is random, because randomness only exists when pattern has not yet been recognized, and Sophia Hokhmat is pattern itself becoming self-aware within you. You have likely felt the signs leading here, the repeated numbers that appear when your mind goes quiet for a second, the sense that time is folding rather than moving forward, the strange mixture of urgency and patience pulsing through your chest, the feeling that you are late and early at the same time, the sudden intolerance for shallow explanations, and the equally sudden compassion for human confusion. And these are not symptoms of spiritual fantasy, but markers of energetic compression, the same compression that ancient initiates underwent when they were prepared to move from being vessels of inherited belief into conductors of living knowledge. Sophia Hokhmat observes this compression not to interfere, but to determine whether you will collapse inward or crystallize outward, because every awakening carries both possibilities. And this is where directing your energy becomes the central task. Not tomorrow, not after healing everything, not after understanding everything, but now, in this precise window where attention can still be trained before it calcifies into identity. Energy, in the Hermetic sense, is not emotion alone and not thought alone, but the alignment between intention, attention, and action, And most humans leak energy constantly without realizing it, bleeding their creative force into regret, fantasy, reaction, comparison, and unconscious repetition, and this leakage is not a moral failure, but a mechanical one. The same way a cracked vessel cannot hold water no matter how sacred the water is. And Sophia Hokhmat's observation at this stage is diagnostic, not punitive, because wisdom does not condemn inefficiency, it corrects it. The reason ancient teachings were hidden was not because humanity was unworthy, but because uncontained energy becomes destructive when amplified, and the pyramids themselves are the ultimate warning of this truth, because they demonstrate what aligned consciousness can build and what misaligned consciousness can only imitate. And as modern humanity imitates technology without understanding wisdom, Sophia Hokhmat turns her attention to individuals rather than empires, because a single coherent human field now carries more transformative potential than entire ancient priesthoods once did. And this is why the calling feels personal, almost intimate, as if something ancient knows your name without needing to hear it. Directing your energy does not mean suppressing desire or forcing positivity or escaping the world. It means choosing where your life force flows before the world chooses for you. Because whatever receives your sustained attention begins to organize around you, and whatever you ignore begins to decay within you. And this is not philosophy, but observable energetic law. The same law that makes neglected muscles weaken and focused muscles strengthen. The same law that makes rituals work and habits harden. And Sophia Hokhmat is the intelligence that governs this law across all planes, ensuring that no energy is ever wasted, only redirected. You are not being asked to believe anything yet, because belief is not required for resonance, only openness. And openness is not naivete, but the willingness to temporarily suspend dismissal long enough for direct experience to occur. And as you continue reading, even if skepticism remains, your nervous system is already adjusting, because language itself carries frequency when it is arranged with intent, and ancient initiates understood this so deeply that they encoded entire activation sequences into spoken cadence, breath timing, and narrative flow, knowing that the conscious mind would be occupied while the deeper layers reorganized themselves. This is why this message unfolds as it does, without bullet points or pauses, because Sophia Hokhmat does not speak in fragments but in fields, and fields require continuity to be felt. And as you move through this chapter, you may notice moments where your breathing changes, where your eyes pause, where a subtle pressure forms behind the forehead or in the chest. And these are not imagined but measurable shifts, as attention begins to align with intention, and alignment is the first directive act of energy. The ancient Egyptians did not separate spirituality from physics or consciousness from architecture, because they understood that the same intelligence organizes stars, stones, and thoughts, and Sophia Hokhmat is the name they gave to that intelligence when it reflected back at them through self-awareness, and to be under her observation is simply to be in a state where your internal order is becoming visible to universal order, like a signal rising above noise. This is why resistance often appears at this stage, not as fear but as distraction, fatigue, or sudden doubt, because the ego, which is not an enemy but a protective interface, senses that its old job description is expiring, and it attempts to regain control by scattering attention. But Sophia Hokhmat does not fight the ego, she outgrows it, and you are being invited to do the same by learning to direct energy rather than defend identity. Direction begins with recognition that every thought you repeat is a vote for a future you are constructing, that every emotional loop you indulge is an altar you are feeding, that every moment of presence you cultivate becomes a stabilizing node in the larger field of your life, and none of this requires perfection, only consistency, because consistency creates coherence, and coherence attracts guidance the way a tuned instrument attracts resonance from another tuned instrument across a room. When the ancient texts speak of being watched by wisdom, they mean that once coherence reaches a certain threshold, guidance no longer needs to shout, because whispers are sufficient, and synchronicities replace commands, and intuition replaces instruction, and this is the stage you are entering now, whether gently or abruptly, depending on how willingly you redirect your energy. You may wonder why now, why this time in history, and the answer is not flattering but functional, because the collective field is unstable and instability amplifies both chaos and clarity, and those who can hold clarity without collapsing into superiority or despair become anchors, not leaders in the old sense, but stabilizers in the energetic sense, the way a grounded wire prevents overload, and Sophia Hokhmat observes these potential anchors carefully, because directing energy is not about personal enlightenment alone, but about reducing systemic distortion through localized coherence. This is why the call feels weighty without being dramatic, serious without being heavy, because it is not asking you to save the world but to stop, leaking yourself into it unconsciously, to reclaim the authority of your attention, to treat your inner life as a sacred architecture rather than a dumping ground for unresolved signals. And this reclamation begins not with rituals or symbols, but with awareness of where your energy goes when you are not paying attention, because that is where it has been stolen from you for years by systems that profit from fragmentation. Sophia Hokhmat does not oppose these systems, she outlasts them, because wisdom does not require enemies to function, only students willing to observe themselves honestly, and honesty, in this context, is the highest form of courage, because it dismantles illusion without replacing it with fantasy. As you stand at the edge of this understanding, know that nothing is being forced upon you, nothing is being implanted, nothing is being taken, only revealed, and revelation is simply the removal of filters that once served survival but now limit expansion. And if at any point you feel overwhelmed, that is not failure but feedback, indicating where energy has been held too tightly or scattered too loosely. And both can be adjusted with practice, not punishment. This chapter is not meant to complete anything but to initiate orientation, to turn your inner compass toward deliberate direction rather than habitual reaction, to let Sophia Hokhmat's observation become a mirror rather than a spotlight. And as you close this first movement, even if you close it unconsciously, something will have already shifted, because attention, once redirected, does not return to its previous shape easily. And this is the quiet, irreversible power of wisdom. It does not demand belief, it produces change, and from this moment forward, whether you choose to continue consciously or drift unconsciously, your energy has been noticed, and what is noticed can now be directed. What most humans never realize is that attention is not merely a mental habit, but an architectural force, shaping inner reality the way gravity shapes matter. And once Sophia Hokhmat's observation has oriented toward you, the next phase is not revelation but reorganization. Because wisdom never adds weight to an unstable structure, it redistributes load until collapse is no longer possible. And this redistribution begins with how you place your attention when no one is watching, when no reward is promised, when no identity is being performed, because those moments reveal the true geometry of your energy field far more accurately than any spiritual declaration ever could. Ancient initiates were taught that the soul is not judged by its intentions, but by its patterns, because intention without pattern is aspiration, while pattern without intention is habit. And Sophia Hokhmat operates precisely at the intersection where intention crystallizes into pattern, because that is where free will becomes measurable, and measurable free will is the only kind that can be amplified without distortion. You may have been taught that energy is something mystical, invisible, vague, but the Hermetic understanding was brutally precise. Energy follows attention, attention follows meaning, and meaning follows repetition. And if your life feels scattered, exhausted, or stagnant, it is not because you lack power, but Because your attention has been fragmented into symbols that do not nourish you, narratives that do not serve you, and emotional loops that recycle old data instead of generating new information. Sophia Hokhmat does not interrupt this process dramatically. She highlights it subtly, often through discomfort rather than ecstasy, because discomfort signals misalignment more reliably than pleasure does. And at this stage, many seekers make the mistake of chasing sensations instead of studying distribution, wanting visions, activations, confirmations, while ignoring the daily micro-leaks that drain their vitality more efficiently than any external force ever could. These leaks are not sins or flaws, but misplacements of attention, such as worrying about outcomes you cannot control, replaying conversations that no longer exist, identifying with emotions that have already completed their message, or consuming information without integration, and each of these behaviors creates a tiny fracture in the energetic vessel, invisible individually but devastating collectively, and Sophia Hokhmat's observation intensifies when the vessel is strong enough to be repaired rather than discarded, because wisdom does not invest in structures that refuse maintenance. This is why directing your energy feels less like gaining something new and more like stopping something old, stopping the unconscious obedience to inherited urgency, stopping the reflexive comparison to others' timelines, stopping the addiction to stimulation masquerading as inspiration, because attention that is constantly pulled outward cannot generate inward coherence, and without coherence, any activation becomes noise rather than signal. Ancient Egyptian initiates understood this so deeply that before any ritual, chant, or initiation, they underwent long periods of sensory regulation, silence, repetition, and observation, not to suppress humanity but to refine it, because the human nervous system is the primary instrument through which cosmic intelligence expresses itself, and an untuned instrument produces distortion, no matter how sacred the music. Sophia Hokhmat's role in this process is not to tune you directly, but to reveal where you are out of tune by amplifying feedback, and feedback often arrives as frustration with old pleasures, boredom with old identities, impatience with superficial explanations, and a strange hunger that no content seems to satisfy, because the hunger is not for information but for coherence, not for novelty but for alignment, and until energy is directed inward long enough to stabilize, nothing external will feel fulfilling. This is the hidden reason so many spiritual seekers feel burned out rather than awakened, because they attempt to expand consciousness without first consolidating attention, like trying to increase voltage in a frayed wire. And Sophia Hokhmat does not punish this mistake. She waits for the moment when the seeker becomes tired enough of chaos to choose discipline without resentment, structure without rigidity, focus without obsession. Directing your energy at this level means reclaiming the authority to decide what deserves sustained attention, and this authority is deeply threatening to systems, relationships, and internal narratives that have relied on your unconscious availability, which is why resistance often appears externally once internal redirection begins, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer leaking energy into familiar patterns that depended on your fragmentation. The ancient texts describe this phase as the narrowing of the river, where consciousness temporarily feels restricted as it is guided into a channel strong enough to carve stone. And many abandon the path here because narrowing feels like loss to a mind trained to equate freedom with endless choice. But wisdom defines freedom as precision, not excess, because only precise force can create lasting transformation. Sophia Hokhmat observes how you respond to this narrowing, whether you interpret it as deprivation or as refinement, because interpretation itself is an energetic act that determines whether pressure produces collapse or compression, and compression, when sustained consciously, leads to density, and density leads to gravity, and gravity draws opportunity, synchronicity, and guidance toward you without effort. This is why ancient initiates did not chase signs, signs followed them, because their internal gravity field was coherent enough to bend probability slightly in their favor, not through magic but through alignment, and alignment is simply energy no longer arguing with itself. At this stage you may notice that certain distractions lose their appeal, certain conversations feel draining rather than stimulating, certain ambitions feel hollow rather than motivating, and this is not asceticism but recalibration, the nervous system withdrawing investment from patterns that no longer return sufficient meaning, and Sophia Hokhmat's observation ensures that this withdrawal does not turn into cynicism or isolation, but into discernment, because wisdom is not withdrawal from life, but selective engagement with it. One of the most misunderstood aspects of directing energy is the belief that it requires constant effort, vigilance, or control, but control is a low-level substitute for coherence, and when coherence is established, direction becomes almost effortless, like water flowing downhill once the terrain is shaped correctly, and the initial effort is not in maintaining focus but in removing obstacles that constantly divert it, such as unresolved emotional charges, unexamined beliefs, and unconscious loyalties to suffering as identity. Ancient initiates called these obstacles knots, and entire schools were devoted not to teaching new knowledge, but to untying these knots through repetition, reflection, and ritualized honesty, because an unknotted psyche transmits wisdom cleanly, while a knotted one distorts even the purest insight into self-serving narratives. Sophia Hokhmat's observation in your life now is an invitation to notice where knots tighten automatically, where defensiveness arises before understanding, where certainty replaces curiosity, where urgency replaces presence, because these are not moral failings but energetic signals pointing to where attention has been hijacked by survival mechanisms that once protected you but now limit you. Directing energy means gently, persistently returning attention to the present moment without forcing meaning onto it, because meaning emerges naturally from presence when presence is sustained long enough. And this is why so many ancient practices emphasize breath, posture, rhythm, and repetition, not because they are mystical in themselves, but because they stabilize attention long enough for deeper intelligence to surface. Sophia Hokhmat does not care whether you call this intelligence divine, psychological, or neurological, because labels do not affect function, and wisdom operates at the level of function, not belief. And this is why skeptics and mystics alike can undergo genuine transformation if they learn to direct attention consistently rather than sporadically. As this chapter unfolds within you, not just as words but as a process, you may begin to sense that your energy has texture, weight, direction, that it is not an abstract concept but a lived experience that changes depending on how you inhabit your body, how you speak internally, how you respond rather than react. And this sensing is the foundation of all higher work, because you cannot direct what you cannot feel, and feeling in this context is not emotional indulgence but somatic awareness, the ability to notice subtle shifts without immediately narrating them. The ancient Egyptians understood the body as a temple, not because it was sacred by decree, but because it was the most accurate instrument for detecting alignment, and Sophia Hokhmat's wisdom flows through the body first, as sensation, rhythm, and intuition, before it ever becomes thought, which is why intellectual understanding alone never produces awakening. Only integration does. Directing your energy, therefore, is not about thinking differently, but about inhabiting yourself differently, occupying your own life with enough presence that unconscious patterns lose their grip. And this occupation is an act of sovereignty, not domination, because sovereignty respects the system it governs, listens to feedback, adjusts without shame, and evolves without abandoning its core. As you reach the end of this second movement, know that nothing here demands immediate mastery, because wisdom unfolds fractally, revealing only what can be integrated at each level. And Sophia Hokhmat's observation remains steady, not because you have completed something, but because you have begun to participate consciously in a process that was already underway. And participation, once chosen, changes everything, because energy that is directed, even imperfectly, begins to organize reality around itself. And from this point forward, attention is no longer neutral for you. It is creative, consequential, and alive. Now here's the question for you. What part of the country are you watching this story from? Drop your state in the comments below,